Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
Oh, I'm getting tired of carrying these Roswell crash pieces around with me all these years, Tim. I mean, I dug them out of the desert there, and I try to show them to people, and I even take them to the Roswell Museum, but nobody believes me that these are the real crash, the parts of the crash saucer, even though somebody said they look like petrified doggy poo or something. I don't know.
Maybe if they didn't have "Made in China" stamped on the back of them.
I don't know. I've used 3 shovels so far to dig for the Roswell UFO, and all I've got to show for it is a receipt from the local hardware store. But tonight we're going to find out about some real UFO, and I use the word crash is in quote marks here because at least the one incident involves what we would call a soft landing. But I've got to kind of twist my neck back, Tim, because I've been working on a book that will be out in a couple of weeks called Amityville and Beyond. And you know how those poltergeists are. They're always forever spitting pea soup at you and making you kind of like float up to the ceiling. So it's taken me a while to get back down to earth here, but we're going to be talking about outer space tonight, and damn those poltergeists. We'll get back to them some other time. So, Tim, what have you been doing all the week except for working hard on actually that book as well, because you submitted a very great piece?
Well, yeah, I was just getting ready to say that I spent a lot of time in research on my chapter for the Poltergeist book, and I tell you something. After doing that research, I'm inspired now to because of my final conclusion, which I'm not going to reveal now. They'll have to buy the book to read for themselves. Gosh, I'm inspired maybe to put out my own book, or write my own book for you on my thesis that I had for that chapter. So, but we'll talk about that.
Well, very, very, very good. But we're drawing in a lot of elementals or elements here on this, yes, because it's just not poltergeist normally the way we think about ghosts and wandering spirits and demonic representation. We've got a lot more going for us, thanks to guys like you and Brad Steiger, and of course our good buddy up there in Rhode Island, Paul Eno. And he's got some very creative ideas. And so we're sending this one slightly in a different direction. You'll find some ghosts and other normal poltergeist phenomena in there, but we go way beyond. But enough of this, because it's not our topic for tonight. It's our topic for another evening.
Yeah, we'll save it for another time.
Yeah. Okay, Tim, tell us what is going on here.
Well, tonight, Tim, we are going to be talking about, and as you said at the beginning of the program, we'll be talking about crashed or softly landed or, retrieved, maybe flying saucers. Retrieved, maybe.
Retrieved. That's a good
Yeah,
one.
maybe a
Yes,
better
yes.
word. And I should emphasize that, it's not all about Roswell. If you're not familiar with the subject, you may think that, the Roswell UFO incident is the only one out there, and it's not. And that's the unfortunate thing, because so many people have made like a litmus test almost on the whole Roswell crash, and the whole UFO phenomena, that so that if anybody would finally come up with really good solid evidence that the Roswell crash did not happen, or if it really was a mogul balloon or something like that, you're going to hear all of these skeptics and newspaper reporters, out there saying, the Roswell crash didn't exist, so that means the whole UFO phenomena is bunk, which is just utterly ridiculous. But we both know, we've seen it before, and that's exactly what they'll do. So thank heavens, we have people like Harry Drew and Paul Smith, who have conducted research on other saucer retrievals that have happened in the past, and so we're just absolutely thrilled that we have them here with us tonight. Now, both of them are have been on our show before, but we're going to cover new ground. I know Paul has a new book based on his research on the Cape Girardeau UFO crash, and then Harry Drew. The last time that Harry was on our show, we just started to talk a little bit about some of the strange incidents that happened around Kingman involving what could possibly have been extraterrestrials. But we ran out of time and we couldn't continue that topic. So I hope that we can take off where we left off the last time Harry was on, and continue that fascinating thread.
Well, we can sing in order to introduce Harry. Why don't we sing a couple of bars too? I'm just wild about Harry. And then,
I'm sure he would appreciate that.
I will save you that. I have done everything from being in movies and being in plays and doing, of course, my own show. I tried music a couple of times, and well, if the band is good, you can pretend that you're really proficient at doing it. And luckily, I was a couple of times I got up on the stage, but I retired my. I'm on the Edgar Winter album, Frankenstein, but that's another story. Anyway, Harry, how are you? Paul, how are you? How you guys doing out there? And Kingman, Arizona, and Paul, you're in Missouri, and we've got some interesting conversation to get into tonight. So, Harry, let's get over to you out there in Kingman, Arizona, and on the outskirts of the desert. We've heard about the UFO incidents at Kingman going back to 1953. What we have called a soft landing, because the objects did not, crash into the earth. We know that there were some entities involved in the incident. In fact, they kind of roamed around, I guess, the city there for a while, and even ended up incarcerated. Now that's got to be a first, I would guess. I don't know of any other incident where ET has been incarcerated. Maybe some of you guys do, but that's the first one I've heard of. So, Harry, why don't you tell us what's going on out there in Kingman? Oh, Harry.
Oh no! I think we lost
scared him.
Harry.
I scared him away.
Scared him away. Well, we'll start with Paul then.
Well, Paul, tell us what's going on in Kingman.
I was actually through there in 1985, and it's just beautiful out there.
Well, I had an incident in Kingman. I was driving past the Dairy Queen, which is kind of you have to go around to get out of town. You go past the Dairy Queen when you come in off the highway. And I stopped with my friend Cersei, who's been on the show talking about Greek mythology, and we stopped into a trading post. Just you look at some jewelry, and you got to take some gemstones back, even though you probably got a box full of them at home with them at home, and you don't know what to do with them anyway. But a little bit of turquoise kind of can brighten up your day. So we go into this place, and it's really desolate. It's in the middle of the afternoon. And it's pretty hot, and I guess this fellow's the proprietor, or certainly the manager on duty, and we get to chatting and mentioning our interest in the paranormal and so forth. And he says, the back room is haunted. I said, the back room is haunted. He says, yes, it has the spirits of Native Americans there. And he said people have seen, like apparitions and things have come flying off the shelf and so forth. And I said, well, that's nice. We haven't had a good poltergeist a story in a couple of days, and it, obviously, the poltergeist phenomenon, ghostly phenomenon, is all part of the American heritage. Tim, as we found out, right? You've written on this quite a bit, and then I happened to mention, and this is before I knew Harry, I happened to mention that there was a supposed UFO incident there in 1953. Well, the gentleman's face turned a little bit ashen. And he said, well, I'll tell you something if you promise not to repeat it. Well, those are always the words when you bring out your notebook. Okay. And so he tells me, my friend, that he has hidden away some photographs of UFO beings, UFO aliens that have been taken, and they are in the custody of somebody he trusts in another state, because he has the feeling that he may be watched, or if anybody knew about this, they would try to confiscate him, or harm would come to him, and so forth. Now, at that time, and this is going back maybe 10 years ago now, I took the gentleman's card, of course, and said that I would be in touch. Well, I tried to contact Stanton Friedman about this, because I thought he would, since he had written all this literature and spoken out on Roswell so strongly, I thought that he would be interested in perhaps what might be a legitimate UFO crash tale with alien bodies involved. Can't guarantee it. I didn't know this fellow from a hole in the teepee. I just walked into his store there and got in a conversation with him. I don't think it's the type of thing that somebody would just bring up and say, "Hey, I got alien photos in the back room." It just doesn't seem to it works that way. So I tried to get Stan to get interested in it, and I never heard back from him. And over the years, I always said, well, I should try to get back, in touch with this gentleman and see if he'd release the photographs or give us a little bit more information. And now, of course, after the years have gone by, I can't find the card. So there you go. Anyway, Paul, so you've written a second book on the incident. You managed to come up with enough material for a second book?
I did. I had some that did not make the first book, and then people began contacting me with some more information, and some of it kind of blew my mind, so I put together a second book, and it's been out since like late October, early November.
All right, well, now, we've done a show before on the original incident, but obviously we have listeners tonight that weren't with us before, because the program is growing both on the KCOR radio and on our YouTube channel, Mr. UFO Secret Files. So why don't you just put this in a nutshell? Go back to 1941, correct?
Right.
And give us a short rundown on what happened then, and then we can get into what's happened since that you found out.
Okay. My Cape Girardeau story is about 6 years before Roswell, while Harry's is 6 years after Roswell. But in April of 1941, we'll base it around the recollections of a woman named Charlotte Huffman Mann, who said her grandfather came home one night just quite shaken and pale and told his family, "I'm going to tell you this story once and I'm never going to speak of it again." And apparently he lived up to his word. He was called out to what he was told was going to be an airplane crash outside of town. about 12 or 13 miles from his home in downtown Cape Girardeau, which was a city of about 20,000 people, very conservative church-going community. Well, Reverend Huffman got out there with a police associate and saw the flames and saw the smoke and saw the fire department, police department, apparently the sheriff's department, men in military uniforms, what he said were FBI agents, and some members of the press taking some pictures, big flashbulb pictures going off. And what he found was a crashed round disc, gray metal, perhaps we would call it brushed aluminum or brushed nickel in appearance today. And it was cracked open with a silvery debris field of metal shrapnel all around the field, glinting in the flames that were being put out. It had crashed in a fireball. And I found out recently from a gentleman who contacted me, said his grandmother knew the man who saw the crash, ran into his house thinking it was an airplane, and called the Cape Girardeau operator, who got him in touch with the fire department and the police. They were in the same building in those days. And they sent out first responders. And when he ran out into the field, he found out, just like everyone else, this was not of this world. Well, Reverend Huffman was perhaps you would say late to the party. There was such a crowd there, and local farmers picking through the debris, and people quizzical about these 3 dead bodies on the ground. 2 of them were side by side, face up in the grass, supposedly pulled from the wreckage. And then there was a third one that when Reverend Huffman looked closely, he was still alive. His chest was going up and down. He was still barely breathing. So Reverend Huffman said prayers over the third one, while one of the other 2 aliens was propped up by 2 local men for a photograph, which was snapped by a man with a little box camera like a Brownie Kodak. And 2 weeks after the crash, this photographer who took this bizarre photo of the alien being propped up under the arms, the photographer came by Reverend Huffman's house and said, "I have this photograph. I want you to have a copy of it." And he handed it to Reverend Huffman, who really didn't want it. And the photographer took off fast because supposedly there was an air of some amount of paranoia and fear in Cape Girardeau. People did not want to get caught because the Army came in that night and told everyone, "You did not see this. This did not happen. It's a matter of national security. Put down that debris. We'll take all your notes and film and camera images, and you were never to speak of this matter ever again." So they dispersed the crowd, and that's why Reverend Huffman went home quite shaken. He had just been sworn to secrecy, so naturally he broke that oath and told his family, who were very concerned about him, what was going on. And then he managed to keep the lid on for the rest of his life. His son held on to the photo and showed it at a few family gatherings, and the little granddaughter, Charlotte Huffman, saw the photo now and then and asked her parents about it, and they wouldn't give her a straight answer. But towards the end of her life, her grandmother was dying of cancer and told the whole story of how Reverend Huffman went out there that night and saw the 3 big-headed gray aliens that we see so much in literature nowadays, and how Reverend Huffman was silenced and quite intimidated, as many people were around Cape Girardeau. And it's interesting to note that my own stepmother said she heard the story in the 1960s when she was going to high school in Cape Girardeau. Charlotte Huffman Mann's letter that got investigated by the likes of Stanton Friedman and others did not come out until the mid to late 1990s. And so I was told recently by a source that Rush Limbaugh, famous Cape Girardeau resident, told a few friends that he heard the story back in the late 50s or early 60s when he was growing up in Cape Girardeau. So there's some real substance, and I found some other tales of interest and put together my new book called 3 Presidents and 2 Accidents, which you can get on any major online book retailer or directly from www.arguspublishing.com, where shipping is free.
Hey, what are the 3 presidents?
I deal with, first, President Roosevelt, who was in office at the time. What was he doing on the night of the crash? And I researched and found out he was up very late, past midnight, for some strange reason, at the White House. He was supposed to go to bed early.
Was he using his Twitter account?
Yeah, he was tweeting nasty insults about people. Well, he usually kept that to himself.
I
But in
suppose,
those
yeah.
days, of course,
Yeah.
they had no internet and no Twitter, no cell phones. The president was confined to a wheelchair, and he wasn't in the greatest of health. But I also take a look at what future President Harry Truman was doing around this time. He was a Cape Girardeau resident in 1906 when he was training in the Army Reserve. And I look at another future president who was going to college in 1941, and later he saw his star rise quite considerably when he was added to the Office of Naval Intelligence and seemed to find out a number of things. And he was wiretapped by the FBI and followed around Washington, and his name was Jack Kennedy.
Son of a gun. Okay, well, these are some pretty powerful people. I mean, but do you think that they know about this UFO incident there?
I would sure like to have a smoking gun for you, but I put together all the clues, and I'll admit they are logical conjecture and fact, and I don't have absolute evidence, but I point out how they very likely almost had to have known. If anyone in the United States Congress was told, it would have to be Harry. This was his constituency, his
Yes.
part of the country. He was a powerful Freemason, the Grand Master Freemason of Missouri. And President Roosevelt and Vice President Henry Wallace were 33rd degree Freemasons, and they were buddies that kept secrets together. Even the Speaker of the House and the Director of the FBI and many other people in FDR's cabinet and his Secretary of the War Department and the General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, were all Freemasons. Very devoted.
I can't help but believe that on the back of the dollar bill, that floating top of the pyramid with the eye in the middle must be a secret clue.
President Roosevelt and Henry Wallace, a few years before this incident, were instrumental in getting the seal of America changed to these somewhat Masonic symbols and made the mainstream seal of America you see to this day.
Well, we like the all-seeing eye. I like the all-seeing eye. Anyway, so it's an ongoing story. Have you uncovered any additional witnesses?
Only somewhat. For instance, I had a woman who told me that she did not get to see the crash, but she was around 10 years old at the time and remembers all the adults around her talking excitedly about this outer space ship, they called it, that had crashed on a farm not far away from where she lived, and that there were little people, is what they called it back then, that were found dead on the ground. She said we did not use the term flying saucer or ET or
of course
UFO.
not,
Yeah, she said that wasn't discussed, just little outer spaceship with little people. She passed away this past summer, and so there goes another source. The problem with this story is, of course, it's now over 75 years old. All the witnesses are gone, and in many cases, their children are gone. So it's tough to find out things, at least firsthand. I did find some information on the internet from some two brothers that were part of an esteemed conservative Cape Girardeau family who said on the internet a couple of times.
We're gonna
I'm out.
We have a break coming up, so we'll be right back with Paul Smith and Harry Drew.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre, and I promise this time I will not overmodulate my microphone, send my VU meter crashing over into the other side. I'll do my NPR voice. Welcome to Exploring the Bizarre. All right, so now we now have Harry Drew back with us. Harry, I guess that just as we were getting ready to bring you on, you had a little bit of what do you call it, a cosmic incident there at your house?
Well, yes, I was thinking about mentioning something of interest that I found on Roswell, and then there was a brilliant flash of light and thunder, and then everything went dark, and I lost you, of course. And so I pondered if I should mention it. But being that I'm talking with Tim and all all those there. But Tim Swartz, the last time we talked, you said, my story in regard to what I have found from Kingman sounds very familiar with some of the things about Roswell. So I went over, I'm not a student of Roswell, and I went over to look at research material, not what everybody's written, but what and how I look at research things. And I thought, well, this is interesting, because the first story that broke, that went to NICAP, the forerunner of MUFON, that was from an interview with a man by the name of Arthur Stancil, conducted by a really good researcher by the name of Raymond Fowler. That was done in April, May of 1973, and it was followed very closely by the principal people who 8 years or 7 years later would write about Roswell. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because the some of the events that seem to correlate were already told about Kingman, and ultimately Raymond Fowler published a story in the April edition, 1976, of UFO magazine, and it was after that there was nothing written in the interim, and then all of a sudden there was a whole bunch of things written about Kingman, new stories. I mean, incredible things that actually don't have any basis in fact, and they're still being portrayed and still being used for reference or the substance of things, even unfortunately with like MUFON Hangar 1. Hangar 1 Season 2 Episode 8, and it shows things that not only didn't happen, couldn't happen, was impossible to happen, because nobody did research to actually look. So they portray the Kingman UFO shot down, going down in flames at night. And I'm talking about the one that soft landed.
Right.
And for all of those people out there that don't know about the Kingman UFO, it ends up, I live in Kingman area. I'm a historian, and I've been one for over 40 years professionally. And I wanted to know, was this or was this not a myth, a legend, a hoax? What was it all about? And so I proceeded using the methodology and the protocols of my profession, and I found things that were astounding, that are backed up by things on the ground that you can find and look at, and documents. And so that kind of abbreviates what's going on. But it all started with an interview with a man named Arthur Stancil, who worked on Operation over at Frenchman Flats nuclear bomb test, and was called after work on the evening of May 20th, 1953, about reporting after work the following day at Indian Springs Air Force Base to fly down with some other specialists to Phoenix, Arizona, where they were loaded aboard a bus, and there was 25 scientists waiting for them, all given sack lunches, and away they went on the 21st in a Model 3301 GM bus, 820 of them made by the U.S. Army, and the driver's name was Dennis. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I know, and one of the leading authorities, self-professed, says I have a big folder on Kingman, and I'm telling you here and now, trust me, I have big boxes full of big folders on Kingman, and lots of things, but I have the advantage, my profession, and I live here. And so I devoted pretty much all the time for 6 years out in the field and in doing research in research facilities, the sheriff's office, with the court, getting security clearances to go places that people aren't allowed to, and seeing things, photographing things that are pretty freaky, went way past anything I ever imagined. And it also led to me finding out other things, where I was doing photos outside of the 1915 Mojave County Courthouse, which is on the National Register of Historic Places in Old Town Kingman, and it has in the basement is where the sheriff's office was in 1953, because the jail sheriff's office that had been built in 1910 was falling apart. They had prisoners holding on the bars, and the whole set of bars fell out on the sidewalk. So it was in pretty bad shape.
Right.
And so they're basically below the ground with no windows, and it's an area now that for 30 years been off limit to the public. And I'm telling you this because it's rather interesting for anyone listening, I hope, because I went right into science fiction because this was the third UFO, not the first one, and it had hit the Wallapai Mountain, which is 8,256 feet high, full of elk and mountain lions and timber, and it set the mountain on fire in front of everybody in Old Town Kingman. And a Forest Service worker came across two individuals right at the source of the fire, and they were wandering around like they didn't know where they were, and they wouldn't talk to him when he spoke to them, and they were being watched by a newspaper reporter who followed him. But he wrote down, Joe, the Forest Service worker, just took two strange-looking men, quote, two strange-looking men into custody, and they were taken down to the 1915 courthouse, and they were locked up in the lower part of the building that is a concrete vault, 14-inch steel reinforced concrete for the ceiling because it's the main floor of the courthouse building. And these two individuals were locked in the room. The sheriff wasn't in. One deputy was sent out. 3 deputies were in the sheriff's office in behind 2 locked doors. And the Forest Service worker who sat down on an oak bench that is still there at this moment. And yeah, freaky, because the head of the county court security took me into the area and allowed me to see it. I had a document described it, and it's exactly as described. And I was surprised to see some things like the bench still there after this many years. But they brought the sheriffs back, and at that point he had been trying to talk with the military because they wouldn't let him through to where the first one went down. That's the soft landing, which went down on the 18th. The next one came on the 22nd and crashed 20 miles, basically north by northwest of Kingman. That's Red Lake, Mojave County, not New Mexico. And so he may have been with the sheriff, or he could have been down with Opie at the pond, because it was like Mayberry, USA here in 1953. There's 3,400 people. And so they briefed him on what happened. He told them to open up, and they stepped in, and there was nobody there. And the reporter wrote down, quote, and they vanished, unquote. And there's no way out, Harry. I have all the photos. It's in my in a new hardbound. I have it sitting here in front of me. But I was filming out in front, and I was talking about this for video when an elderly man came out of a church down the street because his grandchildren had come up when they were listening to me talk to myself on a camera. And he said, what are you doing? And I told him a little bit. And he said, oh, you mean the ones that crashed 30 miles south of Kingman? And I said, no, I don't know about those. And yeah, and so I found out from old timers, the ones that I did know, and old timers that I just met like that, about some other things that happened here. 1950, an incredible thing. And I mentioned that in a note to Timothy, that it's just, I could do a whole book on that because it involves 5 strange-looking men, okay? And
5?
Harry,
and their vehicle.
I have one question I just want to throw in here.
Yeah.
Now, okay, you've come out publicly. You've been on quite a few shows now. Has the local Kingman media, whatever might exist there, done like anything about your research, your work?
The only thing ever about it was there's something I probably can't tell you right now that I was informed by other people why Kingman's, the main media, apparently still doesn't talk about this. Okay, and it has to do with the belief. Okay, but the answer is there's just this thing about Arthur Stancil. And let's put things in perspective. Arthur Stancil arrives here early evening on the evening of the 21st day of May, 1953. And there was a quarter moon. He's right. This is from the interview. Quarter moon. I found the site, and it was left by the Air Force like they left yesterday. Everything they left is there right now. Okay? And I did, with the help of an engineer who was helping James Cameron with the Mariana Trench dive, he left and came up and ran a drone for me with 6 cameras, so I could do some 10-foot and 30-foot off the ground films, and then I photographed 360 twice using what would be comparable to 35 millimeter, so that I have what the site looks like as found. Okay, because if it ends up like Roswell, there won't be one pebble left in the area, you know, and right now it won't, that isn't going to happen, because that and the Red Lake sites are both deemed archaeological sites. Okay, so just because of the what was left behind by modern day man 60 years ago, you know, or 63, but Arthur Stancil spent 1 hour on the ground at the landing site, and he and the rest of the specialists and scientists were loaded back in the bus, and they were transported back to Phoenix, and he was flown back to Indian Springs, Nevada. That's north a little bit of the bomb site area for Upshot Knothole during that time, and a lot of bomb bursts. By the way, students were brought out of schools in Kingman, and they sat on the lawns and watched the bomb blasts, okay, from Kingman. And like Harry, which was a very large detonation that happened on or around the 19th of May, which caused a tremendous amount of problems for St. George, Utah, because the radiation cloud stalled right there. And that's another story somebody can look up. But the point here is Arthur Stancil was only on the ground 1 hour. Now, all of the stories come from the interview. That would be what you'd have to say. Or somebody had to go and interview people. There's been several attempts of people coming here to try to interview. Well, 2 that I'm aware of. One who was actually more like he was going to really do kind of an interview. And I had calls from old timers saying, hey, there's a guy in town, you know, and he wants to know. They won't tell. They do not tell. The people, the old timers, century families here that went through the World War II period, there was a large Army Air Corps training base here, very large, B-17 bombers, and they trained pilots, co-pilots, side gunners, and turret gunners, and all of this stuff. And they had blackouts here. If the military said, you don't say anything about anything you see today, if a UFO landed in their front yard, they wouldn't have any memory. And they are very patriotic, even so now, and that's good. And but they were very patriotic, and they would not share with anyone outside. And many of the people living here today, the older families, are all related to a rancher by the name of Leonard Neal that came up from the Big Sandy River that's down by Wickiup in the late 1800s. And they're related. The Red Lake crash was called Foo Tank. Foo Tank is the name in Arizona given to a small dirt reservoir to water 100 or 200 head of cattle. Okay, and the Red Lake UFO ricocheted off a butte. It didn't have a chance to land or even just skid along the ground. It hit a rocky butte just short of the top, ricocheted, went 0.21 miles, and landed on the other side of Futang. That's a reservoir that had some water in it. It's from runoff, sometimes snow, but it's almost always like now. You get some rain. And the two of the occupants received severe injuries to their lower extremities because the bottom front of the craft was pretty well torn out. And then the other two crew members were shaken up, and they were taken straight up to Groom Lake, where the first crew went, who were completely fine, no injuries, and the other two injured were taken to Nellis and passed away.
Well, Harry, was there a description of what these occupants look like?
Yes. Now you have to remember, there are several people that are very important to all of this, and so many have passed away. And I have an interview with an 85-year-old man who is a former colonel of the United States Air Force. He was a fighter pilot, test pilot, and he, as an airman, he was a part of the retrieval team that was here, and he was the last living member of the retrieval team. And then I find out later, he had not only an associate, a partner, who was also a lieutenant colonel, or became a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. But he told me, as they came up, the craft is sitting at the landing site. Now, this is as told to me, okay? And this is always something a historian wants to make sure to pass it on. It can be embellished in places. His memory was perfect as far as anything I could determine, okay? And he alone is the one person that mentioned something that gave me a landmark that led to me being able to connect other things that I had discovered, that led me to the landing site. Or I wouldn't have, maybe I'd have found it. But I didn't know what to look for exactly. What does a landing site look like? Everything looks like a desert and brush and, this kind of stuff. And it's like 20 square miles, 400 square miles. Mm-hmm. And so he said, with still awe, he spoke with he was still rather stunned by this. He said when they got out, there were 4 crew members standing outside the craft. I couldn't fly. And they're next to a 1912 wagon road, okay? And he said they were human. That's what he told me. And I said, human? Do you mean humanoid? And they said they looked human. They were 4.5, 5 feet tall, rather slender. They were wearing coveralls, flight suits, okay? And short, sandy cropped hair. They looked like us. Mm-hmm. And they would, if they were on the population walking down the street, they'd look like us. And this is what he told me. They didn't have what they expected. Mm-hmm. Was like George Powell's War of the Worlds. You got a Martian with antenna and 3 eyes and this kind of stuff. And it wasn't. And he did not know where the landing site was, because they were not in a position when they were brought from Nellis 2 hours after the craft went down in the afternoon of the 18th of May. And they flew from Nellis in to Kingman, the airport at Kingman. And that's critical because of some stories told about it's an airport, okay? But they came in and they were loaded up in a truck with canvas across the back and flaps. He had no idea which way because of driving around where the airport is and the roads that are there. By the time they got out of there, they didn't know which way they were headed. And when he finally got almost to the destination, the truck made a sharp turn in one direction or another, and the flaps came back and they could see something. That's what he described to me. And then they pulled in and stopped 50 feet away from where the craft was sitting. And that ultimately is where the bus came. and the bus offloaded one person at a time as they were called by a military policeman and escorted over to a part of the craft where it was something to do with their expertise. But this elderly Air Force man told me all of this and then said they were the crew were immediately dispatched to Groom Lake. Groom Lake was a facility that was handed off to Edwards Air Force Base by the Army Air Corps in 1951, and Edwards used it for what it's been described to me, but a continuation of what Edwards does now. And they use black budget money. And if nobody's heard of black budget money that exists, they didn't get any a lot of different things didn't get any funding until 1955. When I say they didn't get funding, open congressional budget funds. And so they used funds they already had that could be used for development. And Groom Lake, that's Area 51. I mean, that's what we call it now. And the landed craft is the craft the entire Area 51 story is based on. That craft was removed. I know how they got, there was no military. I'm going to back up. There was no military here after August 1945. Prior to June 1945, the airport tower had fallen into disuse. In June of 1945, this is important for people that are serious about the Kingman story. In June of 1945, all the equipment in the tower was stripped out, including the PIP radar screens, and it was all destroyed. And then in August of 1945, the military left forever from Kingman. They stored aircraft there for about 1 year, and then handed off the entire facility, including the main runways, to the city of Kingman in Mohave County.
All right, Harry, I'm going to have to interrupt you here, Harry, because we are coming up on our top of the hour break. So when we continue with this, we'll bring back Paul Smith in and continue our conversation with Harry Drew on Exploring the Bizarre.
Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
I think that's the thunder, the lightning and thunder that brought down the crash in Roswell. And we've actually secretly put it on our show without telling anybody. The evidence is here. It's right here at KCOR, Exploring the Bizarre. We got the real stuff. None of this hokey pokey nonsense that you hear on all these other shows where they try to steal your thunder and lightning and all this stuff. Right, Tim?
We have it hidden in plain sight.
That's what it is. But our guests are not hidden tonight. Are they, Tim?
No.
Thanks for lightning. One of them almost was.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah.
He's turned to ashes out there in Kingman. Yes. Okay.
No, tonight we have Harry Drew and Paul Smith, but I want to remind our audience that if you have questions for our guests, then please feel free to send them in our direction. Go to the chat room, text us, carrier pigeon, remote viewing. It wouldn't be remote viewing, would it? It would be the opposite of remote viewing.
Or send them via an alien.
There you go. Yeah. But we want your questions. We want to hear from you. So, if send them our way. We always love to hear from our audience.
Out of all the subjects we covered, Tim, I think this is my favorite. I mean, I just enjoy a good UFO retrieval story. I mean, it's. I remember Len Stringfield used to put out these little booklets. You know, he got all the my goodness, I don't know, hundreds of different reports, and
Oh yeah.
I guess some of them in there were legitimate, and some of them I know were like totally hocus pocus, like the alien that was supposedly buried in the basement of the Empire State Building. Well, I know that one was a hoax because I was there when the guy who made the model of the alien brought it into the office of Countrywide Publications, where we were putting or working on UFO. What was the name of the magazine? Official UFO,
Official
which was
UFO, yeah.
yeah, which was the weekly world news of the saucer publications.
Yeah,
And
I stopped reading that magazine when that article came out. I remember seeing
oh,
that, and I was
yeah,
just like, "Oh my God, that's just such
well, the same person that did that is also behind the Necronomicon.
right."
Oh, a con. Notice I use the
Yeah.
but yeah, there were, well, if you had a good hoax to pull, I mean, where else would you go? We didn't publish knowingly published hoax stories in our publications. Plus, we tried to hide our location because I had been threatened a few times. In fact, I actually got an email from this guy who has been stalking me for about 25 years now. He's actually gotten up to the computer age. He used
Oh
to call
no.
them. He used to call in the middle of the night and leave literally threatening messages. And one time, he left his parents' phone number. He was a grown guy. He left his parents' phone number, and I called the number on the phone down in Florida, and they said, "Oh, that's not like Mark Winter. He's never done anything like that before, except the one time he got mad at his brother or some nonsense like that. I don't know. But you just got to be careful and not let people know where you are sometimes. And
Yeah.
some people are cool and some people aren't. But we're getting the aliens won't harm us. I don't think.
Yeah.
So
Hopefully not.
yeah.
Well, let's continue our conversation here with Paul, Tim, because Paul and I, when just before we went to and talk to Harry, you made a comment on how the people in Cape Girardeau, who had who were actually witnesses to whatever crashed there, that they were looking at a spaceship with spacemen. Now, in 1941, and I know that some people have criticized this whole scenario, saying that, people wouldn't have had any idea about, Spaceman in 1941. And, I have to remind him that, a few years before, Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and movie serials like that were extremely popular. And I mean, even though a lot of astronomers at the time, were discounting that we would be able to send a rocket out to outer space, science fiction and, spaceships and people from other planets were very popular, at the time. And so, I mean, I don't think it's too outrageous that people would see something unusual like that and really make that leap of faith and say, yeah, this is a spaceship, and these are men from Mars.
That's true, and don't forget the War of the Worlds broadcast by Orson Welles a few years before the Cape Girardeau crash, which had many similarities, I'll admit. Aliens crashing on a farm and emerging with apparently weapons in the radio play. There were no weapons found in the Cape Girardeau crash, but a panic setting off and farm people rushing around, curious as to what was going on, which actually happened in the Cape Girardeau crash. Which, Harry mentioned the UFO investigator Ray Fowler. Ironically, a little bit of synchronicity. He was the man who received the letter from Charlotte Huffman Mann in the 1990s to kick off the investigation. Ray did some poking around in the story. He passed it along to Leonard Stringfield. You mentioned him. He investigated the story, and he put it in a 1991 book, a couple of chapters. Stanton Friedman picked up on it there, and Ryan S. Wood. And Ryan put it in a chapter in a book in 2005 called Magic Eyes Only. And there's about 3.5 pages on the 1953 Kingman UFO crash I was just thumbing through. So there's all kinds of little connections there.
One of the things that to me stands out is that you have the Kingman crash, and some of the other alleged earlier crashes where the crew or the pilots are reported to be, like Harry said, I mean, basically human. If you saw them walking down the street, you wouldn't have, really turned your head and noticed them. But here we have the Cape Girardeau crash where people are reporting that they are the big-eyed grays, as has become like popular since the 1970s. So I mean, and of course, this is just your opinion, speculation, of course. Why do you think that there is a difference? I mean, do you think that we're dealing with, different planets or different crewmen, or why do you think that there is a difference in the descriptions, of these occupants?
Well, just as there are many sizes and shapes and colors and backgrounds and nationalities of human beings, we have to face the fact that other planets can produce different races on their planet or in the various planets in the known universe, and perhaps interdimensional. And so who knows who's coming here and checking us out? There's never been a more interesting or fascinating period in human history than the last 100 years. I was talking to Linda Moulton Howell last April, and she said she had some scoop on the Roswell crash, and one source told her there was a secondary crash at the time, and they felt it was an escape pod that was ejected while the ship was coming crashing down to Earth. And that may well be what happened in Cape Girardeau. I had some information. A conservative family said some material landed in their parents' yard, and they didn't want to discuss it with me, but this is what they claimed, that at the time of the crash, about a mile away, some material came down, and you could speculate most reasonably that it was an escape pod. And that leads to a second story from 1946, where a peaceful landing took place, supposedly, according to a couple sources I've interviewed, of some aliens that were once again humanoid-looking, stepped down out of their craft in Cape Girardeau and near some wooded area, and looked around, and it drew a crowd of Cape Girardeau residents who stared, and so many people were stopping traffic to stare at these creatures that the police came and said, don't go near them, let them go about their business. They eventually got in their craft and took off at an astonishing rate of speed, but it just shows that they could show up at any time. They could come in any kind of size or shape, and there's almost nothing that we can do about it.
Well, there have been so many of these reports. I think we had Bill Burns on the program quite a few months ago, and we asked him. Of course, he wrote the book by Phil Corso, and we asked him. We said, Bill, like how many UFO? Because we're bringing up a lot of these subjects about different UFO crashes. How many UFO crashes do you think that there have been? And he says at least 1,000. Well, now that figure just like it blows my mind away to some extent, and it's a worldwide number. I mean, he's not just not here in the United States, but the question is, where has all the wreckage gone? I mean, they'd have to be piled up sky high in some hangar somewhere. I mean, or other. It just blows the mind when you hear these figures. Yet, on the other hand, one tends to be, a little bit skeptical about this, of course. But, I mean, I've had stories told to me, too. There's the incident back in was it Farmington, New Mexico, where
Right.
where these probably 500 objects appeared at a high noon over the town, and that was associated with I think the Roswell crash or some of the sightings in those days. And we even have our own legend here of a UFO being shot at, and actually part of it coming off over New York Central Park. Now, you would say, well, that's a totally ridiculous story, but I got it from a source that I believe to be fairly incredible, and it's included in the book, The Case for UFO Crashes, that that I did. It's an update on my Riddle of Hanger 18. But we even had a guest that Tim remember on. Well, we didn't actually have the guest because he didn't show up. But this
Right.
fellow that I had met like 30 years ago down in Florida, who had an actual artifact, an alien glove, except that it said large in the glove, but it was the size of something really, really small. I don't know. It's a freaky story, and these are all freaky to some extent. Do you think, guys, both you and Harry and Paul, you think they maybe are trying to tip us off? And they don't care whether we find their crashed wreckage or not.
I find that a very legitimate question. If you're an intelligent race who took the time to create an intricate lighter than air or gravity defying crash with entities in it, you just leave them behind and do nothing to go back and help your wounded warriors, your comrades that died in a crash?
Well, Harry's story, though. I mean, there with several different crashes there in the Kingman area, and actually, what seems to be crewmen being picked up by the cops and taken to jail only to disappear. I mean, it sounds to me like maybe that those could have been like a rescue crew that that ended up crashing themselves. Would you say that, Harry?
Yes, I would. There's an underground base near here, and that was one of the lead reasons why we were having, maybe why we still have UFO activity. But there are flyways here that were used then. Some are used now. I was looking at one of the flyways on page 9 in my new 22-inch wide full color archival book, and it's looking at a large UFO flyway from the top of the Black Mountains towards Kingman. And it's interesting that the craft, including one supposedly by someone who was supposed to have been a microbiologist at S4 at Area 51, and I listened to this man talking about the Kingman crash and saying it was caused by a lightning hit it. And the only survivor was an ambassador on the way to Los Alamos for some kind of special meeting. And there was no lightning. The last lightning at that time in May of 1953, the last lightning before that was 17 years before. It's just the historical documents go back. But let me give you, this is kind of like on what you're saying and gives you a little more to think about. I'm going to read just a few lines here off of page 10. And it says, historically, general research shows that Roswell was widely unknown, well past the Kingman UFO landing and crashes in May 1953. That is a fact. Not everybody in the world, I see it, it's being said that it's known globally. Not in 1953, it wasn't. It wasn't known here, and what happened here was not known in Roswell. And so just as the flying saucers that attacked an airplane at the Kingman Airport on July 7th, 1947, remained an obscure event, even though it was the very first recorded act of aggression and open hostility to ever have taken place against the human population, as far as a matter of record in our region and probably for the entire United States. And I have that, it's documented. It's front page news. Okay? July 7, 1947, multiple UFOs, flying discs, we call them saucers, attacked two businessmen coming in 600 feet off the ground to land their Cessna, and then there was no tower at the airport anymore in operation. There was a Radio Shack, and so there's like air to ground, ground to air conversation going on. The pilot's scared out of his mind, and so is his passenger, and somebody there, Sparky or somebody, called the local newspaper, and a reporter came out. And by the time he got there, the plane made an abrupt landing to speed up the process instead of just coming in like you normally would. And the guys bolted and ran. And the reporter got a few statements from them before they just pushed him out of the way and kept going. One turned and looked back and said, "I can tell you, we don't need any bromo." Okay? Meaning like they've been drinking.
Yeah.
They were like out of their mind. And I have watched flights of 8 heavy AH-64 attack helicopters. There's no military here. Keep that in mind. There's not been any military here since August 1945. Okay? And attack helicopters coming here, one behind another one, flying low, heavy. If you've ever spent any time in the military in a chopper loaded up, the rotor chop is much louder, and the engine is working harder to carry the load until it offloads, and then it becomes lighter, and the chop noise gets less. And so they come in heavy, and they come out light, and they go absolutely straight to where the old timers told me not to go because the underground base is there. And they told me some stories that I've never been able to verify about what happened to some people who tried. They never did. Not a lot.
They disappear?
Well, the first 3 were found dead, and the second 2 have never been found. So the one thing the old timers here don't talk about, would never talk to me about, and they got uptight about it, was all the rumbling, the shaking that goes on here. Okay? And I almost had a gentleman and some really nice people, a gentleman and his wife who went out in a Jeep Wrangler with their dog to have a picnic out in the desert. And we do goofy things like this. It's like out in my backyard, we have what we call the Garden of Thebes. And it's a fenced-in protected area. I have a horse ranch. And behind me and out toward the north is 35 miles of open desert. We see some incredible things. But that aside, people go out in the desert and just do something. And they set up a little card table, and they're starting to have like some lunch next to their Jeep. And all of a sudden, in a big wash, there are washes here from heavy rains that come in monsoon. In a wash, the ground started to shake. And then dust started boiling out of this wash that was about 100 yards away from them. And their dog ran over and started barking. So they ran over, and the dust is going like mad. And then before they got to the dog and where he was standing, his ears dropped, and he turned, and he bolted back for the Jeep. And when they got there, the rumbling stopped, and the dust lingered and then floated away. And they looked into the wash, and it sounded like maybe a big tracked vehicle, like a Caterpillar or something. And when they got there and looked, there was nothing showing any disturbance at all. And there are certain areas, this is not imagination stuff, there are certain areas that you can go in part of Old Town to the northeastern portion near Radar Hill. Some people say, well, there's some underground there. And there's some underground underneath Old Kingman. But you can feel it's like a vibration. And there's no power generator there or any of that stuff. And you can feel that, and they won't talk about it. Whatever it is, it's too spooky. And it's, I don't know how many people that are Kingmanites that I know that have been there for years that aren't old timers. They're aware of it. They're absolutely aware of it. And it's spooky. It's just spooky stuff.
Now you're talking about like a underground military base.
Oh, well, who knows? Nobody's telling me, you see?
Right.
And I don't know. Okay. But out at the base, I have some photographs that are uncanny, and I've never published these things, and I'm not too sure what I'll eventually do with it. Some of them, especially the ones where there's a flight, and I'm shooting burst shots from a Nikon, okay? And so I'm not getting actual movie footage, but I'm getting pretty much where less than a second goes by, and here I have this footage, and there's 8 of them flying out, and all of a sudden, a disc, write that down as flying saucer, flies right up through them, in broad daylight. Okay, and I've got it on film, and it's not a blurry picture, and stuff that comes out here in the nighttime or the daytime, and the engineer that worked with me was working on the camera in Mariana Trench Dive and developed the most advanced ROV flight control system in the world, and it may still be, and went to the Mariana on the
Harry,
ship.
Harry, unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you here because it's time to go to our bottom of the hour break. So we'll continue our conversation right here on Exploring the Bizarre. So please stay tuned.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with 2 of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
We are back, and it's the final segment of Exploring the Bizarre. So, Paul, I want to bring you in here and ask you, what is the connection with Carol Lombard and the whole Cape Girardeau mystery?
Carol's been in the news. It was just the other day was the 75th anniversary of a very mysterious plane crash that took her life. She was actually decapitated and her body was burned to a crisp, but we won't get into those details. A little gruesome there. She was one of 22 people on board an airliner that left Las Vegas Airport, and a few minutes later smashed into the side of a snow-capped mountain on an incredibly crystal clear night. And there was no excuse with an experienced pilot who had just done a takeoff from Vegas and flown safely to Burbank, their destination, a week before that. Carol was a big FDR supporter and had gotten aboard the plane despite many premonitions of doom. I could go into that in a little more detail, perhaps in another show. But in an airport in Indianapolis, the plane had just made an arrival and departure from the Dayton area, the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base type area, where it was loaded with some cargo and mail, and U.S. Air Force pilots, and a few more got on during the flight. And they took off from Vegas and were 7 miles off course. And they saw what apparently was witnessed by people on the ground. It was a strange yellowish UFO hanging over the mountain where she crashed. They call it Mount Potosi.
You're kidding.
It was a yellowish UFO, according to at least 1 or 2 eyewitnesses. One man said it hung like an amber lantern in the sky.
No way.
Yeah, they said it was there about a half hour before the crash, during the crash, and then just after the crash, it suddenly vanished. It took off. The FBI investigated these reports and kept it from the American people for over 40 years until it was released under a Freedom of Information Act in the 1980s. And this information was heavily redacted. You could barely see some lines mentioning the lights in the sky. And
wow.
So you have to wonder, how could this plane have been so terribly off course? How could it smashed into a mountain in a clear night with unlimited visibility? And so you have to wonder, if there were all these pilots on board, and even Carol Lombard knew how to fly an airplane, the pilot himself and co-pilot, did they all want to go take a close look at this UFO that was just hovering in the sky inexplicably over this mountain? Now there's been many cases.
What was the positioning of the UFO? I mean, exactly where was it hovering? Do we have an actual place, town?
There might have been in one of these reports. I'd have to look it up, how many feet high directly over the mountain it was. Let's say like 1,000 feet or something like that.
No, but we're saying, what mountain are we talking about?
Mount Potosi, part of the Spring Mountain Range in Nevada, a bit north of Arizona, and just east of the California, and headed in the general airway between Las Vegas and Los Angeles, where Carol Lombard was headed to go to her world-famous husband, Clark Gable.
Right on,
and they, of course, got married in Kingman, Arizona just 3 years earlier. So what caused this crash? We don't know, but it's interesting to know that Steven Spielberg made Close Encounters of the Third Kind all about alien spacecraft interfering with the engines of vehicles and entire neighborhoods losing their power. You see Richard Dreyfuss can't start his truck in the movie because these were actual Dr. Jacques Vallée stories that he accumulated of airplanes and ground vehicles like cars and trucks losing their power when they came into contact with higher technology alien crafts or UFOs. So
well, we've had entire communities where the power has been shut off while these objects were hovering nearby, and
right.
there's some I would say speculation, but I would even use a stronger word than that to say that there's some indication that UFOs were present during the big blackout of 1965. Now, I wrote an article on this for many years ago for a little publication put out by Hayden Hughes, who had a UFO organization, and I think he's still out there in Oklahoma somewhere. But he had a little publication, and this had just happened. In fact, I had talked on the phone to this actor who was in the Stuart Whitman, who had this very incredible story about how he was had just checked into a hotel in Manhattan, I guess along Central Park, and decided to take a nap before going out for the evening. And he woke up, and the room was in total pitch blackness. And he pulled the curtains aside in the room, and there was an egg-shaped device positioned outside his window. And he had a conversation with the supposedly the pilot of the or somebody, a crew member or whoever had the bullhorn on board the craft, and they had a conversation there that lasted for quite a few minutes, and they said that they were responsible for the blackout. And that they could, because there were nuclear activity or something, they could, we could cause ourselves great harm. And I don't know if they were ready to interfere, but they showed us that they could possibly interfere. Well, now, that's a pretty speculative story. I talked to him on the telephone for probably a half an hour back in those days. He seemed sincere about it. He wasn't the kind of actor, who was on his way up or down in his career and needed a shot in the arm about this. And it made some news at the time, but has been quickly, obscured by ufological history that knows how to eat its grandchildren, But that same evening or the night before the big blackout, a sexton, which I believe is like a caretaker in a church, was working in the church steeple in Syracuse, New York, and took photographs of this fireball doing some loops in the sky. And there were other reports from that evening, so we do know that they have the ability to do the double whammy, on us if they want, and it seems to be on their terms and not arms. But this is an incredible story that you've just told, and certainly not as far as I know. I've never heard, and I've done books like UFOs Among the Stars, and I did a book about Shirley MacLaine and all, and I have never heard anything that directly refers to this particular incident. So that's quite an amazing discovery on your part. Any chance that some more information may come to light about that?
It's possible. One Carol Lombard biographer recently tried to get the full report from the government on the crash, and he was told he's going to get it. There's a delay. He's going to get it. And eventually they wrote back and said, sorry, you can't have it. And so it continues to be covered up. They don't want you to have the full story.
Well, how about her estate or what was she must have had an estate or a family or?
Yeah, the official story everyone was told was pilot error, that they were somehow not paying attention to this huge looming mountain covered with snow in a dark night, or well, actually a crystal clear night. A passing airline captain a few minutes later said I could look down out of my plane and easily see Mount Potosi covered with snow, and he could see the crash and the flames from many miles away. It's just as plain as the nose on your face, and pilots were warned to stay away from this in notices at the Las Vegas airport. So there's almost no excuse whatsoever for a very modern, well-equipped plane to crash into this mountain.
Well, Paul, like I say, that is an incredible story, and you've heard it here first and maybe exclusively on Exploring the Bizarre. And what for the people are going to want to rush out and get a copy of this the book, like the one you're going to. Oh, maybe you mailed me mine. But what is the title again, Paul?
It's called Three Presidents, Two Accidents, More Mo 41 UFO Crash Data and Surprises. And that's just one of the things that really surprised me while I was researching, that a UFO was possibly even doing this on purpose, luring these pilots and this celebrity over to this area where there were a mountain range, and they knew they would electronically zap any inferior technology in an airplane. It's speculative, of course. But it's interesting to know that Leslie Kean is an author. You may have read her popular best-selling book.
Who she is, yeah.
Yeah, she had a whole collection, a whole book of pilots and airline people tell about how their planes interfered and were damaged, or their power went out when they were buzzed by UFOs.
Well, this just goes to show you there's still an incredible amount of research. Wouldn't you agree, Tim, out there to be done? And the only thing I'm kind of leery about is a lot of the people here in the field are getting a little bit older. Not that any of them lately has done all that amount of research. Well, there are a few that do, but I mean, there's really so much work to do, even on some of these older cases, and some of the information might be eventually coming out. I know some of these top secret papers supposedly have like a 50 years, but they're still covered up. I mean, they'll say they can't find them. But Harry, we want to get we got a few minutes here, and we want to get to some of these other blockbuster stories, or how much we can get in to here. Now, I remember you starting to tell a story one of the previous times that you were on, that these particular beings, we'll call them aliens, because what else are we going to call them at this point, were actually picked up by some strange vehicle that was driving through town, and then when they tried to check on it, they found out that no vehicle was registered?
It's actually even more bizarre than that. First off...
Okay, well, that's why I want you to tell it.
Yeah, thank you for tolerating my hoarse voice and having to blurt out like I have been, so scare off your listeners. It was very unusual because the sheriff, it was the same sheriff that was involved in Kingman in 1953, and he did an opposite thing in 1950, and a flying disc went down and crashed 1 mile from the site of the one that later would go down in 1953. And that's the only similarity. After that, there's a fire on the mountain. There's a man coming down the hill to get more supplies in a truck, and he sees 3 men standing near what is a park today, county park, and they look to be burned. And he picks them up, and they have to load one that he thinks might be dead, and they load it in the back of his truck, and he takes them 16 miles down to get to the Kingman Hospital. There's no such thing as ER in 1950. It's just you go in and they try to help you. And just before they arrive at the hospital, the individual sitting by the passenger door said, "Oh, look, there's our ambulance. It's parked out in front of the hospital. Well, these guys need to go to the hospital." And Kingman, for those who don't know, there's no towns close. Everything is a long distance, and there were only 2 roads that existed in 1950. And so you had a long ways to go. And so the man driving didn't question this, but he stopped and had the 2 individuals stay in the front of the truck, and he walked up to the ambulance where the driver was, and he said, "Who are you?" And the man said, "Why, I'm the ambulance driver." And the man looked down and across to the passenger side and said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm the intern. I help the patients." And so he helps unload the one they think is dead. And the two other ones get in the ambulance and they start to drive away. And the sheriff pulls up, skidding to a stop, and said, "Did you just bring 3 individuals down off the mountain?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "They just left." And the sheriff calls for APB, which he didn't do in 1953. And the 2 roads were blocked by state police. And the town was sealed. It's even smaller than it was in 1953. And so the sheriff asked the man again. He said, "Did you say there were an ambulance?" And he said, "Well, I think it was an ambulance, you know?" And he got the thing and he said, "Well, it kind of looked like an ambulance." Then pretty soon he was saying, it may not have been an ambulance at all. And as they're chasing this thing out of town before they get to the state police, it just goes away. It vanished. And that is on the front page of the newspaper here in the County Miner of 1950.
Oh,
and
boy.
It's the whole 5 men and what they first thought was an ambulance vanished in front of them.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it's in the paper,
Yeah.
so it's like, maybe it's true.
Yeah. It's not fake. Probably not fake news back then. Yeah.
They didn't have a lot of imagination. I'm not insinuating they weren't educated.
Yeah.
I'm insinuating they weren't sophisticated the way we are now. And they weren't exposed.
Or maybe unsophisticated.
Yeah. No, they
Yeah.
lived a simpler life.
Yeah.
And the radio station had just come on in 1949 with the first game of the World Series in 1949. There was no TV. They just got a radio station, okay? Very low powered. And all this stuff. See, and telephones were like Tuxedo 234, this kind of stuff, and no cell phones, no laptops, no iPhones, no nothing like that. And unless somebody from out of town, in fact, you usually read about somebody from out of town, a relative came to visit. That was news.
Oh yeah. Well, I still seen that in some papers, like around Sedona or something.
Yeah.
I mean, There's still a little. That's like the radio stations. Once in a while, I get on a radio. The few that are left, get on a radio station, and they'll interrupt the conversation to give a shout out to Linda's birthday or something like that. I mean, there's still a few of those little stations and papers and all left. I guess they're diminished, by it.
I compressed the story. It's spooky. It's really spooky. They had no idea that they were dealing with something that had the capability to, not just die from getting burnt from crashing a flying disc, but that they were getting into some kind of craft, and they all left. They were picked up.
Hey, how about sending me a copy of the clipping so we could put it up on YouTube?
Okay.
I would love to use that, because some people think that we just sit here and send notes to each other by Skype and make this up as we go along. And Tim, we gave up doing that 30 shows ago, Tim, right?
That's right. No, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean,
No.
you try to make it up, and it's not nearly as strange as what actually happens.
Well, that's what I used to tell them at the at official UFO when they'd sit around trying to make up these stories. I say, "Why do you want to do that, man? I got files and file cabinets full of stuff that's more bizarre than the crazy shit that you're trying to make up for why. I mean, I got the actual witnesses. You don't have anybody. You got some unknown, like anonymous Jane Doe or something there. So that doesn't. That doesn't
Well,
work out.
explain to me where the two strange-looking men wearing coveralls who were locked up in a complete concrete vault, and there's no room for it's below grade, meaning the ground outside is higher than the base of the building. There's no windows, there's no doors, except for one door guarded by 3 deputies and a Forest Service worker, and it was never opened that they know of. How did those two get out of there?
Well, Harry, you tell us. Did they walk through the wall, or did they hypnotize the sheriff or his deputy when they opened the door and walk out past them?
I don't know, and as a historian, I leave that speculation up to the reader or the listener. Is this like these aren't the droids you want? Or open the door and you've never saw us before. I don't know.
Beam me up, Scotty.
That's right. Or they stepped into another dimension.
Yeah.
And I have a relative, by the way, that I won't name here, who is with the super collider. Okay. And they're looking for the God particle and all of that. And I think one of the most important things that was recently found when they think they found the God particle is verification. There were multiple parallel dimensions. Now, isn't that important?
Well, I would think so. But
you didn't hear anything about it in the news, though.
No.
Huh.
Well, there's very little on the news. I mean, the news today is confined to the crawl underneath. What a politician is arguing or not satisfied with something that's going on. There is very little news. In fact, there's a huge chunk of some humongous, iceberg in the Antarctic that's ready to break off and come, sailing this way. Well, we figured that's going to bring, some incredible flooding with it. But you think that that's worth an actual legitimate story? No. Why would we bother, with reporting on something that might actually kill thousands of people? Even to find out about the weather. I mean, you got to turn into one obscure little, weather channel or something because there's no news. Half an hour a day on ABC TV, I sat down and I watched the news where they've condensed every worthy news story into about 45 seconds.
Right.
And that's about it. Aliens have landed in Kingman, and then on with the next story. Go to
Goldstone tracking for NEOs.
NEOs?
Yeah.
Oh,
Goldstone tracking. Okay.
They have a schedule. Shows all the ones that need the science. They need to be monitored.
Yeah.
And the ones that are potential problems, they're inside between the orbit of our moon and the Earth's surface. And those are the ones that are seen, maybe 2 days or 3 days out. They're generally not seen till they go alongside of us because the budget was cut there 8 years ago. And so there's no money for stationary satellites to be watching where they don't have all the problems.
Harry, I hate to interrupt you, but our lovely producer Tina has just started to cut our umbilical cord, and the show will be ending.
It's great to be on with you. Thank you.
Anyway, where can people find you on Facebook, correct?
They can find me on Facebook, but if they go to Kingman UFO Crashers, they can find all kinds of links and photos and stories about what I've really found. Thanks a lot. Happy New Year.
Yes, and it's all linked up on KCO. We'll find everybody. Believe me, if they're out there, they're going to come on this show, and we're going to grill them. Anyway, I want to thank Harry, and I want to thank Paul and Tina and Peter and Carol and everybody else, the aliens whose names we don't know at the moment, and if we did, we would keep it a secret for their own safety. And of course, our co-host, Mr. Tim Schwartz, who's going to be busy working this week on a really blockbuster of a book about how Admiral Byrd is associated or connected with the JFK assassination. It's right. Hollow Earth, Nazi UFOs, disappearing people, strange homicides. It's all in there, and you'll be able to get that after you've purchased our Beyond Amityville book. Good night, everybody. Good night, Tina. Good night, the world. Good night, outer space. And good night, Kingman and the Dairy Queen.
Good night, Kingman. And good night, the world. And good night, outer space. And good night, Kingman and the Dairy Queen. And good night, Kingman and the Dairy Queen. And good night, outer space. And good night, Kingman and the Dairy Queen. 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 And good night, Kingman and the Dairy Qu
been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.